If I had known what that zipper meant, I would have run before the door ever closed. The mirror in front of me reflected a bride I didn't recognize, her white dress too perfect, too untouched, like it belonged to a story I was never meant to live. And yet there I was, standing barefoot on polished marble that felt colder than it should, my fingers hovering near the back of the dress where the zipper stopped halfway, like someone had started something they hadn't finished, or maybe something they were waiting to finish themselves. And that thought made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain, not fear exactly, but something quieter, heavier, like a warning my body understood before my mind could catch up, because nothing about this felt like a wedding, not the silence outside the room, not the way the air didn't move, not even the way my reflection kept looking over my shoulder as if expecting someone to be there. And I swallowed hard, telling myself I was overthinking, that this was just nerves, just the result of signing a contract I barely read 3 days ago. In an office that smelled like leather and power and something I couldn't name, but even then I had known something wasn't right. The way the man across the table never introduced himself, the way everyone else in the room avoided eye contact, the way the pen felt heavier than it should when I pressed it to paper, and I remembered asking one question, just one: who exactly am I marrying? And the answer had come without hesitation. Calm, controlled, almost bored. You'll meet him soon enough. And I should have walked away then. I should have listened to the part of me that knew deals like that never came without a cost. But my family needed the money, and desperation makes you brave in all the wrong ways. So I signed, and now I was here, in a room that wasn't mine, in a dress that wasn't chosen for me, waiting for a man I had never met. And that was when I heard it, the soft click of the door behind me locking, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to tell me it was real, that I wasn't alone anymore. And my breath caught before I could stop it, my fingers curling slightly against the fabric at my sides as I stared at my reflection, because I could feel him before I saw him, the shift in the air, the weight of presence, the kind that didn't need to announce itself to be understood. And then his voice came, low, steady, dangerously calm: don't move. And every instinct in my body froze, not out of obedience, but because something deeper told me moving would only make things worse. And slowly, almost against my will, my eyes lifted to meet his in the mirror, and that was the moment everything changed, because the man standing behind me wasn't just powerful, he was certain, the kind of certainty that didn't ask permission, didn't negotiate, didn't hesitate, his dark suit sharp against the soft white of my dress, his gaze fixed on me like I was something already decided, already chosen, and I realized then that this wasn't the beginning of something. It was the end of every choice I thought I still had, and before I could find my voice, before I could turn around or step away, I felt it, the faintest brush at the back of my dress, his hand finding the zipper I hadn't dared to touch, and my heart slammed once, hard enough to echo in my ears, because I understood, in that exact second, that nothing about this was accidental, not the dress, not the silence, not him, and definitely not me. I should have pulled away when I felt his fingers rest at the base of the zipper, but my body did not listen to reason. It listened to him, to the quiet authority in the way he stood behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence without him needing to touch anything else. And my breath came slower, careful, like I was afraid the air itself might betray me, because everything about this moment felt deliberate, controlled, designed long before I ever stepped into this room. And I hated that realization more than I hated him, because it meant I had never truly had a choice, not when I signed the contract, not when I stepped into the dress, not even now, standing here pretending I still had the option to walk away, turn around. I said, my voice steadier than I felt, and for a second I thought he might ignore me, that he would continue as if my words carried no weight in a space that clearly belonged to him. But then the tension shifted, subtle but real, and his hand paused, the zipper unmoving beneath his fingers. You are not in a position to give instructions, he replied, not harsh, not raised, just certain, and that certainty pressed against me harder than any force ever could, because it did not need volume to be obeyed. It only needed to exist, and I swallowed, forcing myself to hold his gaze in the mirror, refusing to look away even as my pulse betrayed me. Then explain it, I said, quieter now, because something in me needed answers more than it needed pride. Explain why I am here. And for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his expression, not softness, not exactly, but a shift, like I had stepped slightly off the script he had expected me to follow, and he studied me, really studied me, as if measuring whether I deserved the truth or just another carefully constructed version of it. And when he spoke again, his voice lowered just enough to feel personal. Because walking away would have gotten you hurt. And the words landed heavier than they should have, because they did not sound like a threat. They sounded like a statement, like something already proven, and I felt my stomach tighten, my mind racing back to the past few days, the strange calls, the feeling of being watched, the way the contract had been presented not as an option, but as a solution, and suddenly the room felt smaller, the walls closer. That is not an explanation, I whispered, but my voice had changed, the edge of defiance softening into something uncertain, something that hated the possibility that he might be right. And he exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, measured, like everything else about him. No, he said. It is the only part that matters. And before I could respond, before I could decide whether to push further or shut down completely, his hand moved again, deliberate, unhurried, the zipper sliding upward this time, closing the space I had left open, and the sound was quiet but final, like a decision being sealed rather than undone, and my breath caught as the fabric settled back into place, because that small action, that simple movement, told me more than any explanation could. He was not here to take something from me. He was here to define what I was allowed to keep, and that realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding. Because in his world, protection and possession did not exist separately. They were the same thing. And as I stood there, staring at the reflection of the man who now controlled more of my life than I was ready to admit, I realized the most dangerous part was not that he could force me to stay. It was that a small, quiet part of me was starting to wonder what would happen if I did not try to leave at all. The silence after that small sound of the zipper settling into place felt louder than anything he could have said, and I realized I was still holding my breath, like the room itself had shifted into something I could not yet understand, and slowly, carefully, I let the air leave my lungs, refusing to turn around even though every instinct told me to face him directly, because as long as I could see him only through the mirror, I still had distance, I still had control, even if it was an illusion, and I needed that illusion more than I wanted the truth. If this is about protection, I said, forcing the words out evenly, then you should have told me before I signed anything. And for a moment, nothing happened, no immediate response, no interruption, just that same measured stillness behind me, the kind that made you feel like every word you spoke was being weighed, evaluated, and stored somewhere you could never reach. And then he moved, not closer, not farther, just enough that I could see the slight shift of his shoulders in the reflection, like a decision had been made. If I had told you everything, he said, his voice calm in a way that made it more dangerous, you would not have signed. And I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was obvious, because of course I would not have signed, because no one would willingly step into something they did not understand. And that realization hit me, harder than anything else. So you took that choice from me. I replied, my voice tightening despite my effort to keep it steady. And this time, he did not deny it, did not soften it, did not try to dress it up as something else. Yes, he said simply. And that single word settled between us like something permanent, something that could not be undone or rephrased, and I felt it then. The line I had been standing on since this began, the space between anger and something far more complicated. Because part of me wanted to push back, to demand answers, to refuse everything he represented, but another part, quieter and far more dangerous, was trying to understand why he had gone this far, why someone like him would need someone like me in a way that justified taking my choice away, and I hated that part of me, hated that it existed at all. You do not even know me, I said, softer now, not because I was giving in, but because I was searching for something real in all of this, something that made sense, and for the first time since he entered the room, there was a pause in him, a fraction of a second where the certainty shifted just enough to reveal something underneath it, not weakness, but something close to memory. I know enough, he answered, and his gaze did not leave mine in the mirror, not for a second. I know what happens if you walk out that door alone. And there it was again. That same quiet insistence that this was not just about control, not just about power, but about something else he was not fully saying, something he was choosing to keep just out of reach. And I felt my pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the realization that this situation was bigger than I had allowed myself to believe, that the contract, the dress, the locked door, all of it was part of something that had been set in motion long before I became aware of it. Then tell me, I said, turning slightly now, not fully facing him, but enough that I could feel the shift in space. Between us, tell me why me? And the question hung there, fragile but undeniable, because it was the only one that mattered, and for a second, I thought he might actually answer, that he might finally give me something real instead of controlled fragments. But instead, he stepped back, just one step, creating distance where there had been none, and that movement spoke louder than anything he could have said, because it told me he was not ready to give me that answer. Not yet. You will understand soon enough, he said, echoing the same words I had been given days ago. And something in me tightened at that. Frustration, anger, something sharper. Because I was tired of being the last person to know my own story. And as I stood there, in a dress that now felt less like a choice and more like a declaration, I realized that whatever this was, whatever he had pulled me into, it was not going to wait for me to catch up. It was already moving, already unfolding, and whether I was ready or not, I was part of it now, not as a guest, not as a victim, but as something far more complicated, something I was only beginning to understand. The moment he stepped back, the space between us felt wrong, like something essential had been removed, and I hated that my body noticed it before my mind could argue against it, because distance should have meant relief. It should have given me room to breathe, to think, to regain whatever control I still believed I had. But instead it left behind a silence that pressed heavier than his presence ever did. And I found myself turning fully this time, not because I wanted to face him, but because I needed to understand what kind of man could take so much without raising his voice, without forcing anything beyond what he had already decided was his. And when I did, when I finally saw him without the barrier of reflection, the first thing that struck me was not his appearance, not the tailored suit or the calm precision in the way he stood. It was the way he looked at me, like I was not a stranger, not a transaction, but something already accounted for in a plan I had never been invited to see. And that realization unsettled me more than anything else. You keep saying I will understand, I said, my voice quieter now but sharper, like I was trying to cut through something invisible between us. But you are not giving me anything to understand. And he did not interrupt, did not correct me. He just watched, the kind of attention that made every word feel heavier once it left my mouth. And I took a step forward before I could stop myself, closing a small part of the distance he had created, because standing still felt like losing ground, and I refused to be the only one reacting in a situation I did not choose. You brought me here. You locked the door. You decided what I wear and what I sign, and somehow I am supposed to trust that this is for my safety. I continued, and there it was, the truth I had been circling since the beginning, the part that did not make sense no matter how many times I tried to justify it. And for a second, I thought he might finally push back, might assert that same quiet dominance in a way that would end the conversation entirely. But instead, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like he was allowing the question to exist rather than shutting it down. Trust is not required, he said, and the words landed colder than I expected, not because they were harsh, but because they were honest. Compliance is, and my breath caught, not in fear, but in recognition, because that was the difference between us. I was still trying to understand the situation, and he was already operating within it, already several steps ahead, already past the point where explanations mattered, and I felt something in me push back harder, something stubborn and unwilling to be reduced to a role I did not agree to play. And if I refuse? I asked, holding his gaze now without hesitation, because if there was any ground left to stand on, it was this, the ability to choose how I responded even if I could not change the situation itself. And for the first time since he entered the room, his expression shifted in a way I could not immediately read. Not anger, not frustration, something closer to calculation, like he was considering the outcome of a scenario he had already anticipated. And when he spoke, his voice was still calm, still controlled, but there was something beneath it now, something that felt less like a statement and more like a warning wrapped in truth. "You already tried," he said, and the words stopped me before I could respond, because I knew exactly what he meant. The unease over the past few days, the feeling of being followed, the instinct to walk away from the contract that never quite turned into action, all of it suddenly made sense in a way I had not allowed myself to see before, and my chest tightened as the pieces began to align, not fully, not clearly, but enough to understand that this was not a moment. It was a continuation, something that had already started before I realized I was part of it, and I took a slow breath, steadying myself against the weight of that realization, because if he was right, if walking away had never truly been an option, then the only thing left was to decide what I was willing to become inside a situation I could not escape. And as I stood there, facing a man who did not need to raise his voice to change the direction of my life, I realized that the most dangerous part of all of this was not him. It was the possibility that I might start adapting to his world faster than I was willing to admit. The words settled between us in a way that could not be undone, and for the first time since this began, I felt it clearly, not confusion, not fear, but the sharp edge of reality pressing in from all sides, because he was not asking me to believe him. He was not trying to convince me. He was simply stating what already existed, and that difference changed everything, because it meant I could not argue my way out of this. I could not reason my way back to the life I had before, and I hated how calm he remained while I stood there trying to hold on to something that was already slipping through my hands. "So this is it," I said, my voice quieter now, not weaker, just more certain, like I had finally stopped expecting a different answer. "You decide, and I follow." And he did not respond immediately, but the silence this time felt different, less like control and more like observation, as if he was waiting to see what I would do with that understanding. And I realized then that this was not just about him forcing a path. It was about whether I would resist it or adapt to it. And that realization unsettled me more than anything he had said, because adapting meant changing, and changing meant losing parts of myself I was not ready to give up. And yet standing here, in a room that no longer felt temporary, I could not deny that something had already begun to shift. "You keep saying I am safer here," I continued, my eyes still locked on his. "But you have not told me from what." And this time, something in his expression changed more noticeably, not enough to break that composed exterior, but enough for me to see that I had reached a point he had been avoiding. And for a moment, I thought he might deflect again, might give me another controlled answer that revealed nothing. But instead, he exhaled slowly, like he was deciding how much to give. And when he spoke, his voice carried something new, something heavier. "From people who will not ask before they take," he said. And the words were simple, but they carried weight, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just real in a way that made my stomach tighten, because I understood what he was not saying. I understood that whatever world he came from, it did not operate on permission or fairness, and suddenly, the contract, the urgency, the lack of explanation, all of it began to align into something clearer, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to see the outline of a truth I had been trying to avoid. And I felt my pulse shift again, not racing, but steadying, like my body was beginning to adjust to a reality my mind was still resisting. "And you are different," I said, not as a question, but as something I needed him to confirm. And for the first time, there was no pause, no calculation, just a direct answer. "Yes." And that single word should have reassured me. It should have made this easier to accept. But instead it complicated everything, because different did not mean safe. It did not mean right. It just meant that his rules were not the same as the ones I understood, and I realized then that I was not choosing between danger and safety. I was choosing between two different kinds of control, one I could not see and one standing directly in front of me. And as I stood there, feeling the weight of that choice settle into something real, something unavoidable, I took a slow breath and straightened slightly, not in surrender, but in decision, because if I was already inside this, if walking away was no longer an option, then the only thing left was how I would exist within it. "Then stop deciding for me," I said, my voice steady now, grounded in something that felt like the last piece of myself I could still hold on to, and start telling me the truth. And the moment the words left my mouth, I knew something had changed, not in him, but in me, because I was no longer asking for permission to understand my own situation. I was demanding it, and whether he answered or not, whether he allowed it or not. That shift was mine, and it was the first real thing I had chosen since the moment this all began. For a moment, he did not respond, and that silence felt different from the others, heavier, like it carried the weight of a decision that could not be taken back once made. And I held my ground, even as something in my chest tightened under the pressure of waiting, because this was the first time I had not backed down, the first time I had asked for something without softening it, without wrapping it in politeness or fear. And I could feel the shift in the air between us, subtle but undeniable, like the balance had tilted just enough to matter. And then he moved, not toward me, not away, but to the side, his gaze breaking from mine for the first time as he walked past me with quiet precision. And that alone told me something had changed, because until now, he had controlled every inch of space without needing to step outside of it. And I turned slightly, tracking him without fully following, watching as he stopped near the window, the faint city lights reflecting off the glass behind him, outlining his silhouette in a way that made him look even more distant, even more untouchable. And when he spoke again, his voice was still calm, but there was something else beneath it now, something less controlled, something closer to truth. 3 days ago, he said, someone started asking questions about you, and my breath caught before I could stop it, because that was not what I expected, not the answer I had been preparing for, and my mind immediately went back to the past few days, the strange feeling of being watched, the unexplained tension that had followed me from place to place. The calls I did not answer because they felt wrong before I even heard the voice on the other end, and suddenly none of it felt random anymore. What kind of questions? I asked, my voice quieter now, not because I was afraid, but because I was listening in a way I had not before. And he turned slightly, just enough for me to see his profile, sharp, composed, but no longer completely closed off. The kind that come before someone disappears, he said. And the words were not dramatic, not exaggerated, just stated with the same certainty he had used for everything else. And that made them worse, because they did not feel like a warning. They felt like a fact, and I felt my pulse shift again, slower this time, more focused, like my body was adjusting to information my mind had not fully processed yet. And you think this marriage stops that? I said, trying to piece it together, trying to understand how any of this connected. And he shook his head slightly, the movement small but deliberate. It does not stop it, he replied. It changes the risk. And I frowned, the words settling into something I did not fully understand. How? I pressed, because if I was going to accept any part of this, I needed it to make sense. And he turned fully then, facing me again, his gaze steady, unflinching, but no longer entirely unreadable. Because now, he said, you are not alone. And the simplicity of that answer should not have mattered as much as it did, but it did, because it was the first time he had said something that was not about control, not about decisions or compliance, but about presence, about being there. And I hated that it affected me, hated that a part of me registered it as something real, something grounding, even when everything else about this situation told me to resist it. And I crossed my arms slightly, more to steady myself than to create distance, so I am safer because I belong to you, I said, testing the words, feeling how they sounded out loud. And he did not hesitate this time, did not soften it, did not rephrase it. Yes, he answered, and there it was again, that same clarity that made everything feel more final, more real. And I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of that truth settle into something I could not ignore, because whether I liked it or not, whether I accepted it or not, the situation had already shifted around me, already redefined what safety meant in a way I had never considered before. And as I stood there, in a room that no longer felt like a temporary space, but something far more permanent, I realized that the question was no longer whether I trusted him. It was whether I was willing to accept what his version of protection actually meant. And that answer, unlike everything else so far, was still mine to decide. The word yes did not echo. It settled, deep and quiet, like something that had always been there waiting for me to finally hear it. And I stood still for a second longer than I should have, letting it sink into places I was not ready to examine, because the truth was not loud. It did not demand attention. It simply existed, and that made it harder to fight, harder to dismiss. And I hated how easily it found space inside my thoughts. You say that like it is simple, I said finally, my voice measured, controlled in a way that felt new even to me. Because I was no longer reacting, I was choosing each word carefully now, like belonging to you solves everything. And he watched me without interruption, his expression unchanged, but there was something in his stillness that felt more attentive than before, like he was not just listening, but evaluating. And I realized then that this was not just about him explaining his world. It was about him seeing how I would fit into it, how I would respond under pressure, how far I would bend before I broke. And that thought alone made me straighten slightly, grounding myself in something that felt like resistance. It does not solve everything, he replied, and the fact that he did not argue, did not contradict me, made me pause, because I had expected certainty, expected him to insist that his way was the only way, but instead, he acknowledged the flaw without hesitation, and that made it harder to push back. It solves enough, he added, and those 3 words carried more weight than any explanation he could have given, because they were not meant to comfort me, they were meant to prepare me, and I felt something shift again, not in the room, not in him, but in me, because I was starting to understand that. This was not a negotiation, it was an adjustment, a recalibration of everything I thought I knew about control, about safety, about choice, and I exhaled slowly, letting that realization settle into something I could work with instead of something I had to fight. Then what happens now? I asked, and this time, the question was not sharp, not defensive, it was steady, intentional, because if I was going to exist inside this, I needed to know what came next, needed to see the shape of the path. He had already set in motion, and he did not hesitate, did not pause to consider, because this part, unlike everything else, had already been decided. Now, he said, his voice calm, unwavering, you walk out of this room as my wife. And the words should have felt foreign, should have sounded like something temporary, something contractual, something I could separate myself from once this was over. But they did not. They settled in a way that felt real, immediate, like the title itself carried weight beyond the paper I had signed, and I felt my chest tighten slightly, not in fear, but in awareness, because stepping out of this room meant stepping into something public, something visible, something that could not be undone quietly. And I realized then that everything up until this moment had been contained, controlled, hidden within walls that did not belong to me. But the second that door opened, it would become something else entirely, something that extended beyond this space, beyond this conversation, beyond my ability to ignore it. And if I am not ready, I said, even though part of me already knew the answer, and he held my gaze without hesitation, without softening, without offering an alternative. You are, he said, and there was no arrogance in it, no force, just that same quiet certainty that had defined everything he had said since the beginning. And I swallowed, not because I agreed, but because I understood that readiness, in his world, was not about comfort, it was about timing, and the timing had already been decided. And for a second, I considered arguing again, pushing back one more time just to prove that I still could, but something stopped me, not fear, not submission, something more grounded, more deliberate, because I realized that resistance without direction would only leave me reacting, and I was done reacting. So instead, I adjusted the edge of the dress slightly, a small movement, almost insignificant, but intentional, because it was the first action I had taken that was not dictated by him. And when I looked back at him, my voice was steady in a way it had not been before. Then do not expect me to be silent, I said, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to register. Not surprise, not disapproval, something closer to acknowledgement, like he had been waiting to see if I would say that. And when he stepped toward the door, reaching for the handle with the same controlled ease he did everything else, I realized that whatever came next, whatever waited on the other side, I was no longer just being led into it. I was walking into it with my eyes open, and that changed everything. The sound of the lock turning was quiet, almost polite, but it carried a finality that settled deep in my chest. And I realized that this was it. The moment everything shifted from contained to visible, from private to undeniable. And as the door opened, the soft hum of voices from beyond the room filtered in, distant but present, like a world waiting just outside a line I had not yet crossed. And for a second, I did not move, not because I was afraid, but because I understood that once I stepped forward, There would be no stepping back into who I was before this, no quiet undoing, no simple explanation to return things to normal, and I felt his presence beside me again, not touching, not forcing, just there, steady and certain in a way that made hesitation feel temporary, like something that would pass whether I allowed it to or not. "They are waiting," he said, and his voice was low, controlled, but there was something different in it now, not softer, not exactly, but less distant, like the shift between us inside that room had carried forward into this moment, and I nodded once, more to myself than to him, grounding my breath, steadying the part of me that still wanted to pause, still wanted time to think, because time was no longer something I could ask for. It was something that moved whether I was ready or not. And I took a step forward, the fabric of the dress brushing softly against the floor beneath me, the sound barely there, but somehow louder in my own ears, marking each movement like a quiet reminder that this was real, that I was doing this, not being dragged, not being pushed, but walking. And that distinction mattered more than I expected, because it meant that even inside something I had not chosen, I could still choose how I entered it. And as I crossed the threshold, the hallway opened up in front of me, wide, polished, lined with soft lighting that reflected off marble and glass in a way that felt almost unreal, like a space designed to impress rather than comfort. And there were people, not many, but enough, men in dark suits positioned with quiet precision, their attention shifting the moment the door opened, not toward me, but toward him, subtle, respectful, controlled, and I felt it then, the weight of his world extending beyond the room, beyond the conversation, into something structured, something organized around his presence in a way I had never experienced before, and I slowed for half a second, just enough to take it in, just enough to understand that this was not an isolated moment. This was a system, a life, a reality that functioned whether I understood it or not. And then he stepped forward beside me, not ahead, not behind, but exactly level. And that alone caught my attention, because until now, everything about him had suggested control through distance, through positioning, through being slightly removed. But this was different. This was alignment. And I felt the shift immediately. The way the people in the hallway adjusted, the way their focus widened just enough to include me without losing him. And it was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And I realized that whatever this role was, whatever this title meant, it was not just a word, it was a position, one that changed how others saw me the moment I stepped into it. And my fingers curled slightly at my sides, not from tension, but from awareness, because this was no longer about understanding him. It was about understanding what standing beside him did to everything around me. And as we moved forward together, the distance behind me closing quietly as the door shut once more, I felt something settle into place, not comfort, not acceptance, but clarity, because for the first time since this began, I was not asking what was happening to me. I was watching it unfold in real time, and the difference was enough to steady me, enough to keep me moving without hesitation, because whatever came next, whatever waited beyond the end of that hallway, I would meet it not as someone being carried through it, but as someone who had finally decided to stand inside it, fully aware that the moment I did, everything about my life would start to reflect the man walking beside me. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been, stretching ahead like a quiet test I had already agreed to take, and with every step, the sound of my heels against the polished floor echoed just enough to remind me that I was no longer invisible, no longer just another person moving through a space unnoticed, because now every movement carried weight, every glance held meaning, and I could feel it in the way the men stationed along the walls subtly adjusted their posture as we passed, not in a way that drew attention, but in a way that acknowledged presence, his presence, and now, by extension, mine, and I kept my gaze forward, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because looking too closely, reacting too openly, would only expose how new this all was to me, and I refused to give that away, not here, not now, and beside me, he moved with the same controlled ease, the same measured pace that never rushed and never slowed, as if time itself adjusted to him rather than the other way around. And I realized then that this was not just confidence, it was certainty, the kind that came from knowing exactly where you stood in every room you entered. And I wondered, briefly, what it must feel like to live like that, to never question your place, to never hesitate before taking a step forward, and the thought lingered longer than I expected, settling into something I did not fully understand yet. And then the hallway opened into something larger, a reception space filled with soft light and quiet conversation that paused just slightly as we entered, not enough to be obvious, but enough for me to notice, and I felt it immediately. The shift in attention, the subtle redirection of focus, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, like a current changing direction beneath the surface. And for a second, I felt the instinct to step back, to create distance, to let him move ahead the way someone like him was expected to. But he did not. He remained beside me. And that choice, that deliberate positioning, anchored me in a way I was not prepared for, because it meant I was not being hidden, not being placed behind him as something secondary or temporary. I was being seen, and that realization carried its own kind of weight, heavier than fear, heavier than uncertainty, because being seen meant being part of this in a way I could not step away from later. And as we moved further into the room, I noticed the details I had missed at first glance, the way conversations resumed but stayed slightly quieter, the way people observed without staring, the way space adjusted around him without needing to be asked. And it became clear that this was not just influence, it was structure, a world built on understanding roles without needing them to be spoken aloud. And I felt my shoulders straighten slightly, not out of defiance, but out of instinct, because if this was the space I was stepping into, then I would not enter it uncertain, I would not shrink inside it. And as if sensing that shift, he spoke again, his voice low enough that it stayed between us despite the room around us. "Stay close," he said, not as an order, but as something quieter, something that felt more like guidance than control. And I nodded once, not because I had to, but because I understood, because in a place like this, distance was not just physical, it was symbolic, and stepping away would mean something I was not ready to define. And as we came to a stop near the center of the room, the quiet movement around us adjusting once more, I felt the full weight of where I stood, not at the edge, not in the background, but directly beside a man whose presence shaped everything around him. And for the first time since this began, I did not feel like I was trying to keep up. I felt like I was beginning to understand how to stand still within it. And that realization was more unsettling than anything else, because it meant this world was no longer something happening to me. It was something I was starting to step into on my own. The room did not return to normal after we entered. It adjusted, subtly but completely, like a system recalibrating around a new center of gravity, and I felt it in the way conversations resumed with just a fraction less volume, in the way eyes moved without lingering, in the way space seemed to open where he stepped without anyone needing to be told. And I stood there, beside him, aware that I was now part of that shift whether I understood it or not. And for a moment, I focused on something simple, the rhythm of my breathing, the weight of the dress against my skin, the steady grounding of my feet against the floor, because everything else felt too large to process all at once, and I refused to let uncertainty show in a place that clearly rewarded control. And then someone approached, not hurried, not hesitant, but precise, a man in his late 40s with a posture that spoke of experience rather than authority. His gaze directed first at him, then briefly at me, and there was recognition in that glance, not familiarity, but acknowledgement, like he already knew exactly who I was supposed to be in this moment. "It is ready," the man said, his voice low, respectful without being submissive, and I felt the words more than I understood them, because ready for what was a question I had not yet asked out loud. And beside me, he gave a small nod, the kind that did not invite further explanation, and the man stepped back immediately, blending into the room as if he had never interrupted it at all. And I turned slightly, just enough to look at him, searching for something, a cue, an explanation, anything that would anchor this next step into something I could grasp. "Ready for what?" I asked quietly, keeping my tone even despite the tension building beneath it. And he did not look at me right away, his attention still directed toward the space ahead of us, like he was already seeing what came next before I could. "For you to be seen," he said, and the simplicity of the answer did not make it easier. If anything, it made it heavier, because being seen here did not mean the same thing it did anywhere else. It was not casual, not incidental, it was deliberate, structured, something that carried consequence whether I accepted it or not. And I felt my pulse shift again, not faster, but sharper, more focused, like my body was preparing for something my mind was still trying to define. I am already standing here, I said, a quiet edge slipping into my voice before I could stop it, because part of me resisted the idea that this moment had not already begun. And finally, he turned to look at me, fully this time, his gaze steady, direct, and there was something in it that held my attention in place. Not force, not pressure, just presence. Not like this, he replied, and I understood then. Not completely, but enough. Enough to know that what was about to happen was not just an extension of the moment we were in. It was a transition into something more defined, more permanent, something that would place me within this world in a way that could not be quietly undone. And I took a slow breath, letting it settle before I spoke again, because whatever came next, I would meet it without hesitation. Then do not expect me to pretend I belong here, I said, my voice steady, grounded in the last piece of myself that had not shifted. And for a brief second, something in his expression changed, subtle, almost imperceptible, but real, like he had been waiting for that exact response. I do not, he said. And then, after a pause that felt deliberate, I expect you to learn. And the words landed differently than anything else he had said, not as control, not as demand, but as something closer to inevitability. And before I could respond, before I could decide how I felt about that, he extended his hand, not forcing, not pulling, just offering, and the gesture itself carried more weight than anything else in the room, because it was the first time since this began that he had given me a choice that was visible, immediate, and entirely mine to accept or refuse. And I looked at it for a fraction of a second, just long enough to understand what it meant, what it represented, before placing my hand in his, not out of submission, not out of fear, but because I had already crossed too many lines to pretend this one would be different. And as his fingers closed around mine, steady and certain without tightening, I realized that whatever came next, whatever this moment would turn into once we stepped forward together, it would not just define how others saw me. It would define how I chose to stand inside a world that had already begun to reshape everything I thought I understood about myself. His hand was steady around mine, not tightening, not guiding, just there, and somehow that made it harder to ignore than if he had tried to control the movement itself. Because this felt intentional in a different way, like he was allowing me to choose to stay in step with him instead of forcing me forward, and I matched his pace without hesitation, not because I had surrendered to it, but because I understood now that hesitation would only make me look uncertain in a room that measured everything. And as we moved deeper into the space, the quiet attention that had followed us shifted again, focusing not just on him, but on us, on the alignment, on the fact that I was not trailing behind or standing apart. I was exactly where I was meant to be, and I felt it in the way the air seemed to settle, the way the subtle movements around us recalibrated to include me. Without question, and that realization was both grounding and unsettling at the same time, because it meant I was no longer an outsider observing this world. I was being placed within it in real time, and there was no pause, no gradual introduction, just a direct transition from unknown to acknowledged. And I kept my posture steady, my gaze forward, refusing to let the weight of it show in the way I moved. Because if this was the moment he meant, the moment of being seen, then I would not meet it halfway. I would meet it fully, and we stopped near a raised platform at the far end of the room, subtle, understated, but clearly intentional, and the shift in the room became more pronounced, conversations fading just enough to create a space that felt focused without becoming silent. And I felt his hand adjust slightly, not pulling, not pushing, just a small change in grip that signaled something without needing words. And I understood, instinctively, that this was where everything would become official in a way I could not undo later. And for a brief second, my mind tried to step back, to question, to reconsider, but it was too late for that. Not because I was trapped, but because I had already chosen to walk this far, and turning back now would not return me to anything familiar. It would only leave me unanchored in something I had already begun to understand. And I lifted my chin slightly, grounding myself in that realization, because if this was the line, then I would cross it with intention, not hesitation. And he spoke then, not loudly, not to the entire room, but just enough for those closest to hear, his voice carrying with that same controlled clarity that defined everything about him. "This is my wife." And the words were simple, direct, but they moved through the room with a weight that could not be ignored, not because of what they said, but because of who said them, and I felt it immediately. The shift in attention, the subtle recalibration of how I was. Being seen, not questioned, not doubted, just accepted, and that acceptance was not warm, not welcoming. It was structural, like a piece being placed into position within something already built, and for a second, I felt the impact of it fully. The reality that this was no longer just between him and me. It was now part of something larger, something that would define how every person in this space interacted with me from this moment forward. And I turned my head slightly, just enough to look at him, not for reassurance, not for confirmation, but to understand how he held that moment. And his expression had not changed, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I saw it, the slight shift in focus, the way his attention remained steady, not just on the room, but on me as well, like he was measuring the effect of what he had just done. And I realized then that this was not just about declaring something to others, it was about establishing it in a way that left no space for uncertainty. And as the room adjusted once more, conversations resuming with a new understanding woven quietly into them, I felt something settle inside me, not comfort, not acceptance, but clarity, because for the first time since this began, I was no longer asking what role I was being given. I was standing inside it, fully aware that from this moment on, everything I said, everything I did, would carry the weight of that single sentence, and whether I agreed with it or not, whether I embraced it or resisted it, the world around me had already decided how to see me. And now the only question left was how I would choose to exist within that view. The words did not fade after he said them. They lingered, settling into the room like something permanent, something that would not be questioned or revisited. And I felt the weight of it not in the way people looked at me, but in the way they no longer needed to, because the moment had already defined everything for them. And that was what made it real, not the declaration itself, but the quiet acceptance that followed it. And I stood there, still holding his hand, aware that this single position had changed how every person in this space would interpret my presence from this moment forward. And I could feel the shift inside myself as clearly as I felt it in the room, not a surrender, not an agreement, but an adjustment, a recognition. That resisting the title would not erase it. It would only make me stand out in a way that weakened my position rather than strengthening it. And I refused to do that. Not here, not now, and slowly, deliberately, I let my shoulders settle, not lowering them, not tightening them, just allowing them to find a natural position within the role I had been placed into. And that small movement felt more significant than anything else so far, because it was the first time I was not reacting to what he had done. I was choosing how to respond to it, and that distinction grounded me in a way I had not expected. And beside me, his presence remained steady, unchanged, but there was a difference now, subtle, almost unnoticeable, like he was no longer watching for resistance, but observing how I carried what he had already set in motion, and I became aware of the space around us again. The conversations that had resumed with a new undercurrent, the quiet acknowledgments from those closest to us. The way proximity to him now meant proximity to me as well, and it was not warm, not welcoming, but it was structured, intentional, and I realized that in this world, acceptance did not come from emotion, it came from clarity, from knowing exactly where someone stood, and for the first time since this began, I knew where I stood, even if I did not yet know what I would do with it. And I turned my head slightly, letting my gaze move across the room, not searching, not avoiding, just observing. And I noticed the details I had missed before, the way certain individuals held themselves with more authority than others, the subtle hierarchy that existed without being announced, the unspoken rules that govern movement, conversation, even attention, and it became clear that this was not just a gathering, it was a system, one that operated on understanding rather than explanation. And I felt something shift again inside me, not resistance, not fear, but focus, because if I was going to exist within this, I needed to see it clearly, not as something overwhelming, but as something I could learn, piece by piece, moment by moment. And I realized then that his expectation had not been blind. compliance. It had been adaptation, the ability to observe, to adjust, to hold my ground without disrupting the structure around me. And as that realization settled, I made a small decision, one that no one else would notice but me. I did not step back. I did not create distance. I remained exactly where I was, beside him, not leaning into it, not pulling away, just holding the position with quiet intention. And that choice, simple as it was, felt like the first real action I had taken within this world, not something dictated, not something expected, but something chosen. And as I stood there, fully aware of the role I now carried and the way it reshaped every interaction around me, I understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something far more complex, something that would not be defined by a single moment or a single declaration, but by every decision I made from here on out. And for the first time since this began, that thought did not feel overwhelming. It felt clear. The room did not change again, and that was how I knew the moment had passed, not because it was over, but because it had settled into something permanent, something that no longer needed attention to exist. And I stood there, aware of every small detail around me in a way I had not been before, the quiet rhythm of conversations continuing without interruption, the subtle movement of people navigating a space that now included me as part of its structure. And I realized that nothing about this world was loud unless it needed to be. Power here was quiet, controlled, understood without explanation, and that understanding was what I needed to learn if I was going to survive inside it. Not just exist, but stand without being moved by it. And slowly, almost without thinking, I shifted my focus from the room back to him. Because no matter how much I observed, no matter how much I adapted, everything still centered around the man beside me. And I needed to understand that more than anything else. And when I looked at him, really looked this time, not as someone I was reacting to, but as someone I was choosing to see clearly, I noticed what I had missed before, not just the control, not just the certainty, but the precision, the way every decision he made had already accounted for what came next, the way nothing he did felt accidental or impulsive. And I understood then that I had not been pulled into chaos. I had been placed into something calculated, something designed to function exactly as it was. And that realization steadied me more than anything else. Because chaos was unpredictable, but structure could be learned. And as that thought settled, I became aware of something else, something quieter but just as important. He had not tightened his hold on my hand. Not once, not even after speaking those words, not even after the room accepted them. And that restraint, that deliberate lack of force, told me more about him than any explanation could have, because it meant he did not need to prove control. He already had it. And that realization shifted something inside me, something small but undeniable, because it changed how I saw the line between choice and circumstance, between being taken and being placed. And I felt my fingers adjust slightly in his, not pulling away, not holding tighter, just acknowledging the contact in a way that was no longer purely reactive. And for a brief second, his gaze flickered toward me, quick, subtle, but intentional, like he had noticed the change without needing to question it. And that moment, that quiet recognition, settled into something that felt almost like understanding, not complete, not mutual, but present. And I realized then that whatever this was, whatever we were stepping into, it was not going to be defined by a single action or a single decision. It would be shaped by moments like this, small, controlled, almost invisible shifts that changed the direction of everything without ever drawing attention to themselves. And as the room continued around us, unchanged but entirely different now that I understood it, I felt something settle fully into place inside me. Not acceptance, not agreement, but awareness, because for the first time since this began, I was not trying to escape it. I was not trying to fight it. I was standing inside it with my eyes open, understanding that whatever came next would not be something I could predict, but it would be something I could face. And as I turned my gaze forward again, aligning myself with the direction he had already chosen, I realized that the most dangerous part of all of this was no longer him. It was the fact that I was starting to see this world not just as something I had been forced into, but as something I might one day learn to stand in without losing myself. And that possibility, quiet and distant as it was, felt more powerful than anything he had said to me since the moment I first heard his voice.